This is Glenn Robinson, President of the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. I would like to welcome you to our newest edition of Quick Takes on International Affairs. Please enjoy this talk and do consider joining the World Affairs Council.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Bruce Jones. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. Hello. When President Biden gave his first foreign policy address to the assembled staff at the State Department, he emphasized that America is back and clarified that he meant a strategy led by diplomacy, engaged with allies, and re-engaged with multilateralism. It was in effect a point-by-point repudiation of Trump's foreign policy rhetoric and of many of his actions. But President Biden and his team have a challenge. They can rejoin multilateral institutions and reorient U.S. policy towards multilateralism and cooperation. Here's the problem. The multilateral system doesn't work. Or to be more precise, it doesn't work nearly as well as it should, has been stuck on some critical issues for years, and is crying out for deep reform and rejuvenation. So the question that confronts Biden is not, does he want to rejoin the multilateral system? The question is, does he want to do the hard work of retooling it? I want to use today's address to explain why I say this, and why I believe, as I wrote in a recent piece with Susanna Molcora, the former Deputy Secretary General of the UN and the most recent chair of the WTO, that we are in a long crisis of multilateralism. To explain where we are, it's useful to look back, and to make it clear that the current crisis of international order stems from much more than just the anti-multilateral instincts of the Trump administration. Rather, it has deeper roots and has been more than a decade in the making. Well, of course, the world would look different now had Hillary Clinton been elected instead of Donald Trump in 2016. The fact is that powerful changes were underway in the real dynamics of international security, in patterns of globalization, and in the structure of power that we would be grappling with today, with or without the Trump factor. Four dynamics have eroded confidence in and the performance of the multilateral order. First has to do with conflict and security. During the heyday of international cooperation, working together to tackle insecurity and violence was a hallmark of the innovations and the dynamism of the multilateral system. During the 1990s and 2000s, international cooperation brought wars to their lowest level in the world since the end of World War II. But that progress has stalled and reversed. The main dynamic which today impedes conflict management is the fusion of transnational terrorism and civil war. More than 90% of all deaths in war in the past 5 years occurred in countries in which a terrorist organization was located. This violence is heavily concentrated in the Middle East, which accounted for 70% of all battle deaths during that same period. This has generated high death tolls, as well as large-scale refugee flows and region-wide tensions. This conflict-terrorism fusion has overtaken multilateral conflict management efforts. The UN is stymied from acting in critical cases and has dodged the tough policy issues raised by the fusion of terrorism into civil wars. NATO has, of recent period, recorded some successes in adapting itself to deal more effectively with this combined problem of terrorism and civil wars, but has also recorded some serious missteps in this regard. And a major expansion of NATO's out-of-area operations is neither likely in the cards, nor particularly desirable, nor particularly feasible in political terms. People often refer to the prospect of regional organizations stepping up, but in practice have shown very limited capacity. And what's worse, in some contexts, in the absence of an effective international regime for treating civil wars and terrorism, we've seen a reversion to the pattern of proxy warfare that brought us such unchecked slaughter during the Cold War. Even more consequential politically than the reversals on conflict management are the reversals in political support for globalization. The deepening of anti-globalization perspectives is not a right-left issue. In Europe, in the US, and Latin America, there are left, right, and even center voices asking serious questions about the merits of continued reliance on expansive globalization and on reliance of globalized supply chains. Of the major economies, perhaps only Germany has adopted a model that could herald the emergence of a globalization that is both more equitable and more resilient. But in the last several years, Germany has defended that model in part by imposing serious financial and social costs on the rest of the EU. In the rest of Europe, in the US, globalization has been a net positive for GDP, but a net negative for social and political cohesion. It's provided huge benefits to financial elites and those who profit from their engagement, including those of us who work in information services and the research spaces. But at the same time, it's hollowed out the middle classes at great social costs, which we've been obviously living with in this country over the past decade. A third erosion generated little attention until late. We've seen over the past several years important reversals in the international capacity to provide global public goods. The COVID-19 pandemic provides us with a vivid realization of the consequences. Global public goods, or BADs, is not a term of art that most people are familiar with, but it describes issues that are held in common once produced, like clean air or freedom from disease, things that benefit everyone equally. The problem with things that benefit everyone equally is that no one really has a major incentive to spend money to produce them. They might as well wait for somebody else to do it. This dynamic leads to chronic underinvestment in financial stability mechanisms until after a major crisis, underinvestment in public health defenses until after an infectious disease outbreak, underinvestment in climate mitigation until we're confronted with the acute consequences. Just think, the major effort in this country to advance vaccine production, Operation Warp Speed, a very well-managed project, by the way, put roughly $12 billion into trying to improve the speed of vaccine production and distribution. The ongoing reality of the pandemic is costing the U.S. economy literally trillions of dollars on an annual basis. We've barely allocated 1% of that to the effort to contain the virus itself. And this is characteristic of international efforts in global public goods. What's more, we've approached the issue, and many other countries have as well, from a nationalist perspective. We want to tackle the vaccine in our country first, understandable, but we haven't really given much effort to think about how to combat the virus internationally, and that'll come back to haunt us. It's arguably in this area of global public goods that the contemporary nationalist politics and anti-cooperation instincts of major capitals is most damaging. Should the politics of nationalism and withdrawalism continue in the United States, it's going to be very hard to organize the efficient production of global public goods. The rest of the world, and we, are deeply exposed to the resulting global bulk bads, disruptive climate change, pandemic disease, financial instability. In the case of COVID, if we don't get after the business of vaccinating populations in the global south and the developing world and conflict-affected countries, the disease will continue to spread far beyond our borders and mutate and come back. And unless we seal ourselves off from the world on an ongoing basis at vast costs, we will be hit again and again and again by new mutations. Only once the problem is solved collectively is the problem actually solved. Same goes for climate change. Then, of course, there's a rise in geopolitical tensions. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, we face the serious prospect of major military hostilities between the world's top military powers, the United States, China, and also Russia. The geopolitical challenge exists on 3 levels. It's a direct threat to security in its own right. It's a challenge to the liberal basis of the multilateral system, and it complicates efforts to solve all the other problems enumerated above. And it's not just a problem of attitudes, it's a problem of interests. That is, we can decide that we want to cooperate with the Chinese on international security, but they see the world, or at least the Asia-Pacific region, in fundamentally different terms than we do. We can decide that we want to cooperate on issues like cyber and the internet, but it would mean walking away from, or at least substantially watering down, freedoms that have become an essential part of who we are and how we live. Deciding to cooperate and having shared interests to do so are 2 very different things. What's more, the alliance system that we built up during the Cold War is not particularly suited to today's contemporary geopolitical challenge. In Asia, our alliance system is based on a hubs and spokes model with us at the center, which puts a vast military burden on us, while China operates globally in domains that our alliances don't meet, domains like energy investment and information technologies. And in Europe, while NATO is essential in deterring military aggression by Russia, the main challenge posed by Russia is in the information and civilian domains outside of NATO's competence. To quote my colleague Tom Wright, there is no NATO finance ministers meeting, or combined effort to counter Russian disinformation in the civilian and political space. All of which should lead us to ask four essential questions in international affairs. First, how can we retool the alliance system to meet the modern challenges that confront us? To deter China and Russia, but not just in the military sphere, in the civilian, economic, and international order dimensions of their overseas policy. Second, how can we build effective guardrails against great power confrontation? What type of middle-to-power diplomacy can help? Can we envisage new, more effective regional arrangements for crisis de-escalation? Can we revive older understandings of the UN as an instrument that the powers use themselves to de-escalate conflict and to manage proxy wars? And who's going to drive that reshaping? Third, how can key liberal values that have been advanced by the multilateral system be protected? What kind of coalitions for action can be envisaged and articulated to defend those values, both within major international institutions and in developing countries? Fourth, what are the feasible coalitions for action needed to tackle the challenges of conflict, the dynamics of globalization, and transnational threat in the absence of great power unity of the kind that characterized the post-Cold War period? Of course, the election of Joe Biden in November 2020 gives us a point of departure for all of this that is preferable to the instinctive anti-cooperation and anti-alliance stance of the Trump White House. But it would be foolhardy to believe that even under a Biden presidency, somehow geopolitical competition is going to recede, or that we'll suddenly see a gushing of enthusiasm for expansive globalization. Nor will U.S.-China relations suddenly improve. Indeed, they will continue to be very tense and perhaps even deteriorate farther, to say nothing of U.S.-Russia relations, which are set for a very bumpy road indeed. Or that it will suddenly become easy to make major long-term investments needed to adequately supply global public goods or prevent global public bads. So what I and my colleagues at Brookings have been arguing is that the best case scenario in front of us is what we call competitive multilateralism, a competitive struggle over the policy and character of the multilateral order, but a struggle that would at least be, in the main, a non-violent confrontation. There are far worse potential scenarios, to be sure. Those include a full breakdown in great power military restraint, a full-scale breakdown in the provision of global public goods, and a full-blooded return to proxy warfare. These would have disastrous consequences. What is not credible is a return to the cooperation and comity of the post-Cold War era. Effective policy aimed at the rejuvenation of multilateralism should not be premised on a false hope of a return to the golden age of multilateralism, but should instead take the dynamic of great power rivalry as its premise and the reality of competitive multilateralism as its base case. To move forward, I see three essential steps. First, the forging of a coalition of democratic states to advance the liberal agenda or defend it, to work within key international institutions to protect the liberal agenda within them and create space to protect core liberal values, but also to work on adjustments to economic liberalism that is more consistent with addressing inequality, to rebuild a wide political consensus around a version of globalization. Second, a network of middle powers to protect multilateralism, to work across key crises like Iran and key files like trade, to hold the floor on the key frameworks for cooperation and create costs to the top powers, including the United States, should they be tempted to more fully walk away from multilateral frameworks. And last, but very much not least, quiet diplomacy and policy innovation by the major and the middle powers to develop guardrails against great power conflict, as they have sometimes done in the past. All of which would be an ambitious agenda for a world already straining to deal with the response to COVID-19. The second best response that we could see would be that the Asian and the European democracies, the middle powers, work together to hold the floor from the deleterious consequences of American withdrawalism and Chinese expansionism. The best answer will be a return to American leadership of the multilateral order, but met with ideas, ambition, and policy energy, and then by a constructive response from Europe and Asia. But if Biden wants a multilateralist policy, he can't just rejoin, he has to rebuild. Thank you very much.